Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to speak to the Tasmanian Greens' fully costed long-term vision for Tasmania, our alternative budget for 2019-2020. Yesterday, the leader of the Tasmanian Greens, Cassie O'Connor, presented our budget in full, and I will spend my contribution time today providing details on the portfolio areas that I'm responsible for. Madam Speaker, the vision of the Greens is for a future that is healthy, resilient and prosperous for all Tasmanians, where the natural environment is protected and each person feels included, recognised and respected in the society that they live in. We know that Tasmania can be a beacon to the world for sustainability, creativity and fairness. This means that we need to show both heart and courage as leaders. We need to be prepared to see past the short term and also to recognise that investment in the well-being of individual people is an investment in the future well-being for all Tasmanians. This is a time, Madam Deputy Speaker, of a global climate emergency which has been recognised by numbers of national parliaments around the world and an increasing number of hundreds of local councils. As a community, we have to prioritise strong climate action. We can bring down emissions, we can adapt to a rapidly changing climate, and we can create new career pathways that Tasmanians can look forward to working in. On this critical measure in particular, we pay a special focus in our budget, and I will describe how we can act to reduce the soaring unemployment rates in Tasmania, where we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. In the southeast, the unemployment rate amongst young people is 17%. There's a growing number of young people, families and older single people who are finding it harder and harder to rent, let alone to buy a home. This is having a knock-on effect in regional communities where young people are not able to leave home and can't find a house in urban centres like Launceston or Hobart in order to take up employment there. So essentially they're stuck in regional towns when they would otherwise be wanting to move into Hobart or Launceston to take up jobs. At the same time, we know that both patients and staff in all the states for major public hospitals are under intense and intensifying pressure. We've had this confirmed by the Auditor General in his scathing report into the management and the funding of the Tasmanian Health Service emergency departments just this week. The underinvestment in public health comes at a significant disadvantage to people, and it contributes to disadvantage occurring in other areas than their own individual health. Their families, for example, who have to take time off work to look after them. The Greens' alternative budget prioritises high-quality health, housing for all and education services. We make a clear choice to deliver better social infrastructure over roads and bridges. We know how it's possible to really tackle the housing crisis, to increase the supply of secure, affordable and energy-efficient housing. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Greens have always recognised that strengthening our democratic institutions and the human rights of every citizen in an equal society will make for stronger and more diverse and more resilient communities. This alternative budget is a statement of our values, and our values are clearly reflected and in the detail that I'm going to speak to now. Mr Deputy Speaker, this was the hottest summer that we've experienced in Tasmania's history, and we know only too clearly that the fires threatened communities for weeks on end and ultimately burnt 6% of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. We're still feeling the escalating and volatile climate, and people want reassurance that our government recognises the climate emergency and is prepared to act and protect them. They don't want excuses or prevarication any longer. And as the Fijian Prime Minister Barney Marama said just this month, "Cowards don't make history. It's up to governments to muster the will, the creativity and the sheer courage to do it." Mr Deputy Speaker, when the Liberals came to government 5 years ago, they immediately axed the Climate Change Ministry and the Climate Action Council. Following that, they've delivered 6 budgets year on year and State of the State addresses each year with no meaningful action to curb carbon emissions or to prepare our community for the increasingly volatile climate conditions. Last week in Parliament, this Liberal government voted down a statement to recognise the reality of the climate emergency, which was one directly based on a motion passed by the United Kingdom and Irish parliaments only recently. So we've had more than 5 years of climate denialism from this government, and the effect is showing. It's through the leadership only of young people who have come together through the School Strikes for Climate movement and more broadly, and the persistence of the Greens, that we now have the urgency of the climate emergency building pressure on governments, on members of government, on politicians to take the action that we need. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I am speaking to the Greens Alternative Budget 29/20, but it has a companion document which was released only a few weeks ago, and that is a future for all of us, how we can make Tasmania a global climate leader by 2030. This was released by the Tasmanian Greens, by Senator Nick McKim, and work done by Dr Ben Parr in May this year. And it is a blueprint, essentially, for how we can achieve the aim of being a global climate leader by 2030. We know that Tasmania has had the benefit of having a strong thinker in the leader of the previous leader of the Tasmanian Greens, Christine Milne, and later the leader of the Australian Greens. And it was she who first did the intellectual thinking and came up with the brand, which has ultimately become part of Brand Tasmania, which we hear from members' lips in the House on a regular basis, and that is Clean Green Tasmania. It was her thinking and the thinking of the Greens, the party, that came up with the idea of a clean and green state. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we've gone one step further. Tasmania can be a clean, green, global climate leader. We have an amazing opportunity to do this by virtue of our history and our particular geographic position. We are an island, and we can take initiatives towards self-sufficiency that are much more difficult to do on the mainland of Australia and in other continents. We have a temperate climate, and we have an amazing wilderness World Heritage Area, which is of universal value for all humans. We are a small, very connected and flexible community, which means that we have the capability of responding rapidly to great changes. We're also intrinsically interconnected. We are part of families and communities, and whether we like it or not, I think one of the beauties of Tasmanians is that we understand that when the next extreme event comes, whatever our political voting persuasions, we will all be there together. We will all be there together when the next bushfire comes or the next great flood or storm, because fundamentally we care about the people around us in our communities. Our job now is to show the leadership and take the forward action to give people the resources and to prepare them mentally and emotionally for the coming future. We have an amazingly diverse and rich topography with rainfall patterns and microclimates, which give us an opportunity to provide for diverse adaptive responses and to trial different approaches in farming and in other land-based industries. It also gives some opportunity for plants and animals to be able to adapt to different microenvironments if we give them the ability to do that by providing connectivity in the landscape and corridors for animals to move and birds to move between different microclimates. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are also the birthplace of the global green movement, and that is something that, as a member of the Greens, I'm very proud of, because it gives us a unique opportunity to listen to the science and to act now and to act early in responding to climate change. So the Greens recognise that we need to radically reduce our carbon emissions, and our alternative budget reinstates a Minister for Climate Change and the Climate Action Council, which was defunded in 2014. We would also establish a joint standing committee of both houses of Parliament so that climate change will continue to be a focus which is taken very seriously and reviewed on a regular basis by both houses of Parliament. We would spend $2 million a year extra on the Tasmanian Climate Office and put $1.5 million a year into a climate adaptation fund, which would be grants for all local councils and to research institutions to undertake work on how we can adapt it across the state. We would establish a climate resilience audit to undertake an audit of all state-owned infrastructure. Our budget also appoints a chief scientist to oversee government policy with a view to ensuring that the government's response to the climate emergency is grounded in the latest evidence, including evidence from the United Nations, the International Panel of Climate Change, the global work that's being done, as well as the best examples of responses around the world and the exciting research that's being conducted in Tasmania by the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, the University of Tasmania and IMAS. Our budget ends all native forest logging, which is essential to preserve the state's very necessary carbon sinks, as well as to protect the wondrous biodiversity of our forests. We do support plantation forestry, of course. We'd also fund multiple methods of carbon sequestration across farming and land management, including supporting on-farm emissions reduction funds of $8 million and a carbon farming fund of $8 million, and providing renewable support for farmers to be able to increase energy efficiency on their farms of also $8 million. With a dry El Niño that's forecast for the coming summer and with extreme weather events that can no longer be described as exceptional, this budget recognises the costs of responding to these extreme events are expected to soar year on year into the future. With that in mind, we have listened to the firefighters in Tasmania and also to the national fire chiefs who made such an impassioned statement a couple of months before the federal election for action from all governments and political leaders. And we've listened to them, and we'd invest an extra 20 remote area firefighters. We'd also fund the trial of 2 very large air tankers to fight bushfires that threaten homes and the wilderness. We've been deeply concerned to make sure that regional communities across Tasmania have the resources they need to plan for better bushfire protection and fuel reduction. And that is a concern about the ability of people at the individual household level as well as the community level. We can't just rely on written information or web-based information as the mechanism for people understanding how to protect themselves, protect their properties, or when to leave during bushfires. This is an essential tool, but it cannot be the only one, especially given the very high levels of illiteracy in Tasmania generally and in regional communities. So the Greens put extra resources into the Tasmanian Fire Service and make them available to local councils so that people are able to know the risks and to understand how best to respond. We support people on the front line, those people who toil in the harshest of conditions and protect us from fires and clean up after the storms and floods when they happen. Our budget tops up funding to the state emergency services each year by $2 million. Mr Deputy Speaker, our budget also supports the necessary and inevitable transition from fossil to renewable fuels. We prioritise $130 million extra in funding public and electric transport options. We will invest $13.4 million into a public transport authority. That will be tasked with ensuring that Tasmania has a statewide, coordinated, simple ticketing system, and to make sure that there is the continuity of planning between the regional and urban bus systems that bus users so desperately want. We'll make sure that Hobart gets a light rail, and we've invested $36 million into kickstarting the construction of the Northern Corridor. We'll also put an extra $4 million investment into the Derwent ferry system to get cars off Hobart's congested roads. And to really bring down carbon emissions in Tasmania, of course, we need an electric car disruption. We've committed $21 million towards the rollout of electric buses, and we would lead by example and electrify the ministerial and government fleets. We'll support local councils with $8 million in matched funding to help them build more pedestrian infrastructure and cycleways that will also reduce emissions and contribute to improving people's health and to creating more livable cities and regional communities. As well as matched funding with councils, we will direct an extra $30 million across the forward estimates into cycleways and pedestrian walkways, and that will also include our commitment to the Battery Point walkway. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Greens would invest $3 million a year in energy efficiency upgrades to low-income households. These are the people who are hit hardest by climbing power bills. And instead of taking the money from schools that they raise through their renewable energy solar panel systems and the other forms of renewable generation that some savvy schools have invested in, we would return those savings directly to individual school budgets each year and provide $6 million in a commitment to improving energy efficiency in schools and also into other government buildings. Madam Speaker, responsible governments prepare for the future, and the Greens recognise there are massive transitions occurring worldwide in the employment, communication and energy sectors, as well as in the global climate system. Our budget prioritises planning to position Tasmania for tomorrow's opportunities, as well as to be ready for the challenges ahead of us. We want to protect our island's many values that are the source of our clean, green and global leader brand. That's what the Greens are aiming for anyway. Madam Speaker, we have a growing population in Tasmania, and our settlement and land use patterns need to actively reflect the demands of the climate emergency. Planning and the Tasmanian Planning Scheme has to prioritise environmental protection, public participation in the processes of development, and it has to value our shared public places and reserves. The Greens budget establishes, to support a good planning system, the Office of the Chief Engineer, the State Demographer, and it reinstates the State Architect, which was cut by the Liberals 5 years ago. These officers will make sure that Tasmania is equipped with the expertise that we need for their future planning and to provide us with quality and independent advice. We would also institute real statewide policies that would sit across the Tasmanian planning scheme, and we would undertake the work of comprehensive biodiversity mapping, which was recommended by the Tasmanian Planning Commission 3 years ago, but was not taken up by Minister Gutman at the time. We would ensure that Tasmania has an integrated framework for future developments that works both for the people where they live and protects our environment, especially by considering the connectivity of landscapes and of the necessary restriction of settlements within them. We provide additional funding to those bodies that undertake independent assessment that are essential bulwarks to some of the limitations of the Tasmanian planning scheme. These are the Tasmanian Planning Commission, and we provide an extra $3 million across the forward estimates to support the work of the delegates in the Planning Commission. We also fund an additional money to the Resource Management and Planning Appeals Tribunal, and especially to the Environmental Defender's Office, which at the moment exists essentially on public donations and philanthropic donations for the essential work it does in providing independent advice for people in the community about developments and their impact on the environment and also on individual communities themselves. Madam Speaker, the Greens understand that individual health and wellness is the basis of a healthy community, which our investment priorities reflect. The Auditor-General's report this week into the state's emergency department services confirms that Tasmanian hospitals are so full that patients can't get in the front door. As the Auditor-General so poignantly detailed, when acutely sick people arrive at emergency departments, they wait many hours for acute care, and the risk of harm to them because of the excessive waits has increased substantially over the last 5 years. In order to tackle the rising demand for emergency services, we know it's critical to properly fund the preventive health services that can, in the first place, help keep people well for longer and avoid them having to visit emergency departments and go to hospitals at all. The government dropped the ball on reducing the very high rates of smoking, alcohol and drug use and poor nutrition, which afflict Tasmania at rates far higher than the rest of the country by almost all measures. Their promise in 2014 during the election campaign that Tasmanians would have the best health by 2025 has evaporated, and I haven't heard that phrase being used in this place for a number of years now. We've had no meaningful change in the funding outside of the acute health sector since 2014 on any significant measure in preventive health. And we haven't seen any of the systemic reforms that we need to smoking legislation, to put downward pressure on junk food advertising, to increase alcohol and drug education, for example. Madam Speaker, we invest $23 million into community preventive health services, and these include an extra $2 million a year to the Population Health Unit for the very important work they do, and $1 million a year into our Community Preventative Health Fund for grants for particular purpose projects. We continue the funding to Epilepsy Tasmania, which only continues by the government this year, and to the Stroke Foundation. We would also we also provide money for a drug rehabilitation facility, and to staff that facility, $9 million over the forward estimates, because we understand that that it's essential to provide people with proper treatment when they need it, so that they can reduce the dangerous use of drugs or alcohol, and that is clearly by the evidence of the increasing impact of both alcohol and drug misuse in Tasmania. That is clearly a major area of funding that needs more money directed towards it. Madam Speaker, we also recognise that when people need an emergency service, they need to have help immediately. We've listened to the doctors and nurses and to the registrars who wrote to the Tasmanian Health Service Executive a month ago in their Access Solutions paper, and we have funded the extra clinical specialists that they recommended, $6.6 million over the forward estimates for registrars, general medicine, emergency specialists, paediatricians and obstetrician and gynaecologists that they recommend. We've also prioritised funding for 10 psychiatric and 10 emergency department nurses, and would give them the self-defence training funding and the protective equipment that the emergency staff have said is so important to keep them safe in the workplace. Madam Speaker, the levels of mental ill health in Tasmania, including rising depression and anxiety amongst young people, are deeply concerning. And one of the findings from Coroner Olivia McTaggart's inquest into the tragic suicides of 6 teenagers in 2015 was that there must be a dedicated inpatient unit for adolescents or young persons between the ages of 12 and 25, and that it needed to be designed around the needs of that age group, including the treatment of people who are suffering, those young people who are suffering from acute states of mental illness or suicidality. She also recommended that the Centre for Adolescent Mental Health Services be staffed to the equivalent of best practice, so that they can provide adequate services for children and adolescents, and to make sure that there was no longer the practice of freezing the acceptance of referrals or eliminating wait lists when they got too long. So Madam Speaker, we have listened to the people who have been in touch with us on a regular basis over the last couple of years, and the Greens budget commits $12 million for 30 child and adolescent mental health staff, 30 extra staff to be funded. We have listened to young people and their parents talking about galloping rates of anxiety and depression in the community amongst young people, and we would establish extra staff, $2 million across the forward estimates at the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, with specific focus on the issues surrounding anxiety and depression in young people, and for them to provide clinical support and direction towards the development of youth anxiety, depression protective services. We would put another $4 million into that. So, Madam Speaker, these issues can be prioritised. If there's a will, there is a way. And we understand that the Minister has given a reassurance that there will be a child and youth mental health acute dedicated unit in the hospital, but we haven't seen the evidence in writing, and we have funded that in our budget. So we would put the money into the child and youth acute unit staffing that is required. We have dedicated $3.3 million towards that particular work. So, Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to say that the extra $26 million that we've directed into mental health services will mean that young people don't any longer fall through service cracks, and that they can have age-appropriate care, and that we have multidisciplinary wraparound services that focus on protection as well as risk identification. Improving mental health for children also means investing in mental health in the school environment, and we funded 50 extra full-time speech pathologists in schools, which doubles the current number in the public health system. This means that pathologists will have adequate time to work with the students who need personal support to help those children. Our budget invests $8.6 million in extra school psychologists and $6.6 million in extra school social workers. We understand the anxiety about climate and the distress that young people experience at the massive changes that are occurring in the global climate and amongst human societies in general. And we would fund the establishment of a climate resilience program across the public education system. Madam Speaker, this budget acknowledges things that Tasmanians care about the most, and we are very proud to have it fully costed and available for the community to take advantage of.
Thank you.